The dog was going to die on a Tuesday. That was the part that stayed with Renata Hollins long after everything else had faded. Not the gunshot that killed Sergeant First Class Devon Pryce, not the weeks of silence that followed. Not even the morning she walked into a military kennel in Fort Bragg and saw a 90-pound Belgian Malinois pressed flat against the back wall of his enclosure, with his eyes gone completely hollow. What stayed with her was the paperwork. The clean, bureaucratic finality of it. Euthanasia order, animal ID, scheduled Tuesday 0800, stamped, signed, filed. Nobody seemed to think that was strange. Nobody except Renata. She hadn't planned to be there at all. Renata was a surgical nurse at Womack Army Medical Center, not a K-9 handler, not a veterinarian, not anyone with official business inside the kennel facility on the east side of Post. She was there because a friend of a friend had mentioned, offhandedly over bad coffee in the hospital break room, that the dog belonging to that soldier who got killed last month was going to be put down. Something about aggressive behavior, unmanageable, dangerous, a liability. Renata had set down her coffee cup and driven over on her lunch break without entirely knowing why. She'd grown up around working dogs. That was the thing people didn't know about her. Before nursing school, before Fort Bragg, before any of this, there was her uncle's farm outside Asheville, and a German shepherd named Rook who followed her uncle everywhere, and who her uncle talked to in a low, specific language that wasn't baby talk and wasn't Kumkans exactly, but something in between, something that Rook understood completely, and that Renata had spent most of her childhood trying to decode. Her uncle, Thomas Hollins, had spent 8 years in the army before he blew out his knee in Germany and came home to raise cattle and breed working-line shepherds. He still used German commands with his dogs. Not because he was showing off, but because that's how the dogs were trained, and you didn't confuse a working dog with inconsistency. Plats, fuss, blibe, down, heel, stay. She'd learned them before she learned algebra. She didn't know what language Devon Pryce's dog had been trained in. That was the first thing she wanted to find out. The kennel master, a staff sergeant named Guthrie, didn't want to let her in. "You're not on the authorized visitor list," he said, not unkindly, standing in the doorway of the administrative office with the flat, patient expression of a man who had repeated this sentence many times. "I know," Renata said. "I just want to see him. The dog is scheduled for. I know what he's scheduled for." She kept her voice even. She'd learned that in the OR, the quieter you stayed when things were going wrong, the more people listened to you. "I just want to see him. 5 minutes." Guthrie looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at her hospital badge, still clipped to her scrub top from the shift she'd left an hour early. He sighed. 5 minutes, he said. "Don't put your hands near the enclosure." Kodiak was not what she expected. She had braced herself for aggression, snarling, throwing himself at the chain link, the kind of behavior that made paperwork inevitable. What she found instead was a dog who had simply stopped. He was lying in the back corner of the run with his chin on the concrete floor and his eyes open, staring at the wall. His food bowl was full. The water looked untouched. He didn't look dangerous. He looked like an animal that had decided there was nothing left worth moving toward. Renata crouched down at the edge of the run and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. The kennel smelled like disinfectant and hay and the particular metallic edge that big, stressed animals gave off. Somewhere down the row, another dog was pacing, nails clicking rhythmic on concrete. Kodiak didn't react. "He's been like that for 3 weeks, Guthrie said behind her. "Since they brought him back from overseas. Won't engage, won't eat enough to maintain weight. When the handlers try to work him, he either shuts down completely or, twice, he's snapped. Not connected both times. But command doesn't like the liability." "Who was working him?" "After Pryce, whoever was available. We don't have the manpower to assign one handler exclusively to a dog that's already flagged." Renata nodded slowly. She was watching Kodiak's ears. They were pressed flat, not aggressive flat, not warning flat, grief flat. She had not known until that moment that ears could express grief, but she was certain that's what she was looking at. She thought about her uncle. She thought about the specific cadence of his voice when he spoke to Rook, and the way Rook's whole body would orient toward the sound like a compass needle finding north. She said very quietly, "Kodiak." "Sits." The dog's head came up. It was small. It was just a fraction of movement, the chin lifting off the concrete, the ears rotating forward by maybe 10 degrees. But Guthrie made a sound behind her that she'd never heard a grown man make before, something between a word and a breath, and she understood from that sound that in 3 weeks, nothing had made Kodiak move. She said it again. Sits. And then, because she was running on instinct now and not plan, Guter Hund, good dog. Kodiak stood up. He didn't come to the fence. He didn't wag his tail or perform any of the bright, eager behaviors of a happy working dog. He just stood up and looked at her, and the hollowness in his eyes had shifted slightly into something that was, at the very least, attention. Guthrie grabbed his radio. Renata did not expect what came next to be complicated. She had assumed, naively, she would later understand, that demonstrating a response would be enough. That someone would see what she'd seen and say, all right, we clearly had this wrong, let's revisit the euthanasia order. That is not what happened. What happened was a meeting. Then another meeting. Then a phone call from someone at the unit level whose rank she didn't catch and whose tone made it clear that the situation was more involved than a grieving dog with a language barrier. Devon Pryce's death was still under investigation. Kodiak had been present. Kodiak was, in the language of the report she was eventually shown, a potential witness asset, which was a phrase she had never encountered before and which she spent several days processing. A dog, as a witness. And not just any investigation. Pryce hadn't died in combat. He'd died on base 3 weeks before his deployment rotation ended, in a situation that had initially been classified as accidental but had since been reopened. She found this out from a CD agent named Strickland, who appeared in the hallway outside the kennel one afternoon, looking like he'd been awake for a very long time. "You're the nurse," he said. "I am. The one who got the dog to respond. Twice now, yes." Strickland looked at the notepad in his hand. He had the slightly dazed expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. "What made you try German?" "He's a Belgian Malinois with a German working designation number on his collar tag," Renata said. "His handler did a training rotation at Vilsec 2 years ago, according to his service record, which I pulled because Guthrie let me look at the kennel files. German is the most common command language for European working line dogs trained in NATO programs. I figured it was worth trying." Strickland looked at her for a moment. "You pulled his service record, his dog's service record?" "Yes." He wrote something down. "Mrs. Hollins, Specialist Hollins," she said. "I'm active duty, surgical." He wrote something else down. Then he said, "Would you be willing to work with the dog formally, under our supervision?" She almost said no. She thought about it afterward, the closeness of it. How easily she could have said, "I have a job, I have patients, this isn't my area." She was 29 years old, and she had been at Fort Bragg for 2 years, and she had never been involved in anything more complicated than a scheduling dispute about holiday rotations. But she thought about Kodiak standing up when nobody else had been able to make him move. She thought about the hollow in his eyes becoming, for just a moment, something else. And she said yes. The terms of her informal attachment to the CID investigation were never entirely clear, which she later understood was intentional. Officially, she was still the surgical nurse assigned to Womack. Unofficially, she was spending 3 mornings a week at the kennel, rebuilding Kodiak's ability to function, and occasionally sitting in on conversations she almost certainly didn't have the clearance level for. She didn't ask about that part. She was beginning to understand that some doors were better entered quietly. Kodiak's recovery was not linear. There were days when he met her at the kennel door and worked through his commands with something approaching his old precision, sitting, staying, tracking by scent along the fence line. And there were days when he pressed himself back into the corner and refused to engage with anything. Those days, she didn't push. She sat on the floor outside his run and talked to him in the low, even cadence her uncle had used with Rook, mixing German and English and occasionally Dutch, which she did not actually speak, because she'd read that some Belgian lines were trained in Dutch, and she was running out of languages to try. On the 3rd Dutch day, Kodiak came to the fence and sat 4 inches from her knee and let her put her fingers through the chain link to touch the top of his head. Guthrie, who had been watching from the doorway, said quietly, "I've worked with military dogs for 11 years. I have never seen a dog that shut down this hard come back out the other side." "He's not out the other side yet," Renata said. "No," Guthrie agreed, "but he's moving." The investigation was called Operation Ridgeline. Strickland told her this on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like old carpet after asking her to sign a non-disclosure agreement that she read entirely before signing, which seemed to mildly surprise him. Devon Pryce had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest. The original finding, accidental discharge during equipment maintenance, had been questioned when a weapons inspection revealed inconsistencies in the trajectory analysis. Someone had adjusted the angle of the conclusion to fit a pre-existing narrative. When CID started pulling threads, the threads led back to Pryce's unit and a procurement fraud operation that Pryce, based on encrypted communications recovered from his personal device, had apparently discovered and was preparing to report. 2 people from the unit were under investigation. One of them, a warrant officer named Delacroix, had been Kodiak's interim handler in the weeks between Pryce's death and the dog's removal from service. Delacroix is the one who reported Kodiak as aggressive, Strickland said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table. Both incidents, the 2 snapping episodes that triggered the euthanasia review, happened while Delacroix was in the enclosure. Renata was quiet for a moment, so the dog was aggressive, specifically with one person, yes. The person who had a reason to want the dog unable to testify. If dogs can testify. She was still working through the language of that. There's a use under federal case law for trained detection dogs as evidence-gathering assets, Strickland said. If Kodiak can perform a controlled scent identification, specifically identify the scent on items from Pryce's quarters, it closes a gap in our physical evidence chain. What's in the gap? A weapon cleaning kit. Handled by someone other than Pryce the night of the incident. We have the kit. We have the scent profile from it. We need the dog. Renata thought about Kodiak sitting 4 inches from her knee with his head tilted toward her voice. She thought about what it meant to ask an animal that had been through what he'd been through to perform, under pressure in a formal evidentiary setting, with Delacroix potentially nearby. He can do it, she said, but not with Delacroix in the building. There were 3 more weeks of preparation. Strickland arranged for a JAG officer to brief Renata on the evidence protocols, what was admissible, how the identification had to be documented, what would invalidate the result. She absorbed it the same way she absorbed surgical protocols, linearly, completely, with the particular focus she'd developed over years of standing in operating rooms where inattention had consequences. She also kept working with Kodiak, not just on obedience, on the specific skill set that a scent identification required. Guthrie helped her design the training runs, presenting Kodiak with sets of objects and rewarding correct identification. Kodiak was underneath the grief and the shutdown extraordinarily good at this. He had been Devon Pryce's partner for 3 years. He had been trained for exactly this kind of work. On the day she ran him through a clean scent identification for the 5th time without error, Kodiak sat in front of the indicated object and looked back at her with an expression she could only describe as professional satisfaction. She had started learning to read his face the way she'd once learned to read monitors in the OR, the small shifts of muscle and ear and eye that told you what was happening inside before anything external confirmed it. She scratched behind his ears and said, in German, "Good, very good." Kodiak leaned into her hand. The formal identification procedure took place on a Wednesday morning in a controlled facility on the south end of Post. Renata was present in her capacity as the dog's working handler, a designation that had been created specifically for this situation and that would probably not survive the end of the case. Strickland was present, a JAG colonel named Harwell was present, 2 other CD agents whose names she was not given were present. Delacroix was not in the building. She had made this a condition, and it had been met without argument, which told her something about how confident CID was that they already knew what Kodiak was going to find. The scent lineup was 12 objects on a long table covered with brown paper. 11 of them were controls. 1 was the weapon cleaning kit. Kodiak walked the line. He was wearing his working harness for the first time since Pryce's death, and the transformation it produced was visible, shoulders back, head up, the whole body reorganized around purpose. He stopped at the 7th object. He sat. He looked back at Renata. "Good boy," she said quietly. In English, "That's a good boy." Delacroix and another soldier named Petrick were formally charged 8 days later. The procurement fraud had been running for 14 months. diverting equipment contracts worth approximately $2.3 million. Pryce had stumbled onto it through a discrepancy in a supply manifest that crossed his desk by accident. He'd been dead within 2 weeks of documenting what he found. Strickland told Renata about the charges over the phone. She was in the break room at Womack, on the same chair where she'd been sitting when this had started, holding the same style of bad coffee. She didn't say anything for a while after he finished. "The euthanasia order," she said finally. "Has it been formally rescinded?" "Resigned and expunged," Strickland said. "3 days ago. Guthrie wanted me to tell you." She nodded at the wall across from her. "What happens to him now?" "That's actually why I was going to call you regardless." A pause. "The unit has submitted the formal retirement paperwork. Kodiak is medically retired from service. Under the Robbie law, he's eligible for adoption by his last active duty handler, or, in cases where the handler is deceased, by a designated individual, Strickland, Hollins. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Guthrie has already submitted the paperwork with your name on it," he said. "He figured you'd say yes." She drove to the kennel that afternoon instead of going back to her afternoon shift, which was the first time in 2 years she had done anything like that, and later she would have a slightly uncomfortable conversation with her supervisor about it that she did not regret at all. Guthrie met her at the door. He had Kodiak on a lead, not a training lead, a regular leash, a civilian one, black nylon, the kind you bought at a PetSmart. Kodiak was wearing a collar instead of his harness. He looked smaller like that, somehow. More ordinary, more like a dog and less like a weapon. He saw Renata and came forward 3 steps, then sat, which was what he did when he wanted to move towards something, but his training said to wait for permission. "Hey," she said. She crouched down. She put both hands on his face the way she'd wanted to, since the very first day in the kennel, the day she'd found him lying with his chin on the concrete and his eyes gone to nothing. He was warm and solid and present in her hands. "Guter Hund," she said. "Good dog." Kodiak pressed his forehead against her collarbone. She held him there for a while, in the parking lot of the Fort Bragg K9 facility, with Guthrie watching from the doorway and saying nothing, because some things didn't need commentary. Months later, the better part of a year, Renata would be asked by a JAG legal affairs journalist to describe, for a procedural article on animal evidence use in military courts, the moment she had decided to go to the kennel that first time. She thought about it for longer than the journalist probably expected. She thought about the paperwork, the clean bureaucratic finality of a Tuesday morning death that no one had questioned. She thought about what it meant that a dog had kept a secret for 3 weeks inside his own silence, had protected it, in a way, by shutting down so completely that no one thought to look at what he knew. She thought about Devon Pryce, who had found a discrepancy in a supply manifest by accident, and about what it cost him, and about how the only witness to what had happened to him had been a dog who didn't speak English. "I don't know exactly," she told the journalist. "I think I'd seen that kind of stillness before. Impatience. When someone has been through something and no one around them speaks the right language to reach them. And I've always believed that if you take the time to learn the language, you can sometimes find what looks like nothing is actually not nothing." The journalist wrote this down. Then she said, "Is it true you tried Dutch?" Renata smiled. "I tried everything," she said. "You try everything until something works." Kodiak was asleep on the foot of her bed the morning the article ran. He had developed, over the months since his retirement, the working dog's particular talent for occupying exactly as much space as was available to him, which in the case of a double bed with 1 human occupant meant approximately 60% of the mattress. He had also developed opinions about the alarm clock, about squirrels visible through the bedroom window, and about the specific brand of food she'd tried switching him to in September, which he had eaten with the heavy, accusatory patience of a dog registering a formal complaint. He was, in every sense, completely fine. She had started, quietly and without announcing it, working with the Fort Bragg veterinary staff on a protocol for assessing grief response in military working dogs who had lost their handlers. The protocol didn't have an official name yet. Guthrie was helping her write it. A vet behaviorist at Texas A&M had agreed to consult. It was still early, still more question than answer, but it existed, which was more than it existed before. She had also been approached through channels she did not entirely understand about a second case. A dog at Eglin. Different circumstances. Different branch. Same silence, same shutdown, same paperwork building toward a Tuesday. She had said yes without having to think about it. She pulled on her scrubs in the early morning dark while Kodiak tracked her movements with the alert, assessing attention that never fully went off duty, even in retirement, even on the softest of mornings. When she paused at the bedroom door, he raised his head. "Bleeb," she said quietly. "Stay." He put his head back down on the blanket. She drove to work in the November dark, thinking about a dog at Eglin she hadn't met yet, and about the particular kind of silence that looked like nothing and meant everything, and about all the Tuesdays that didn't have to happen if someone just took the time to ask the right question in the right language.